May 25, 1985, Rockville, Maryland. FBI agents blocked Route 270 in the Washington suburbs at 4 o'clock in the morning. Sitting in the stopped vehicle was Chief Radio Man First Class John Anthony Walker, Jr. of the United States Navy, an ordinary, unremarkable 47-year-old officer. There were no weapons in his trunk, no explosives, just documents, codes, ciphers, technical specifications of American submarine fleet communication systems. What Walker did not know, nervously gripping the steering wheel while waiting for a signal from his Soviet handler that would never come that night, was that his own daughter Laura had called the Boston FBI office 3 days earlier. It was not a KGB agent who betrayed him. It was not counterintelligence that calculated his movements. He was turned in by his own family, the very family he had dragged into the most destructive espionage operation in Cold War history. For 17 years, Walker had sold cryptography secrets to Soviet intelligence. For 17 years, he recruited those closest to him, his brother, his son, his best friend, transforming family bonds into a spy network. For 17 years, Soviet submarines read encrypted American messages in real time, as easily as a morning newspaper. Vitaly Yurchenko, a KGB officer who later defected to the West, would call Walker's operation the greatest intelligence triumph in the history of Soviet intelligence. But on that highway near Washington that night, it was not merely one man's espionage career that was ending. It was the conclusion of a story about how the Soviet system attempted to purchase victory in the Cold War with cash, and lost not to counterintelligence, but to something the KGB neither possessed nor could possess, the moral code of a free society, which proved stronger than stacks of $100 bills in a diplomatic dead drop. The Walker spy ring represented a paradox that cut to the very heart of the Cold War's ideological struggle. Here was not a true believer, no communist ideologue sacrificing himself for the workers' paradise. John Walker was a naval warrant officer drowning in debt, seduced by the oldest motivation in the espionage handbook: money. And in this seemingly catastrophic success, the KGB's ability to purchase America's most vital secrets lay the seeds of a far more profound failure. The Soviet Union had always understood one crude mathematics: the mathematics of material desperation. If capitalism produced inequality and debt, then the KGB could exploit that inequality. If the American dream failed to deliver prosperity to every citizen, then rubles could fill that gap. It was a simple calculation, and for nearly 2 decades, it appeared to work brilliantly. What Soviet intelligence fundamentally misunderstood was a different equation entirely: the mathematics of social cohesion in an open society. In a system where family members could question authority, where wives could divorce husbands, where daughters could defy fathers, where the press could expose secrets, and where individual conscience could trump family loyalty. In such a system, even the most successful spy operation carried within it the mechanism of its own destruction. The KGB could purchase betrayal, but it could not purchase silence in a society built on the freedom to speak. This is the story of how the greatest espionage coup of the Cold War collapsed not through the brilliance of American counterintelligence, but through the contradictions inherent in trying to corrupt a free society. It is the story of how the Soviet system, for all its ruthless efficiency in extracting secrets, could not comprehend the one variable that would prove decisive: that in America, even criminals had families who could say no. John Anthony Walker, Jr. was not born a traitor. He was manufactured by the banal arithmetic of middle-class American failure. Born in 1937 in Scranton, Pennsylvania, Walker joined the Navy at 17, seeking the stability and structure his chaotic childhood had lacked. He was intelligent, technically proficient, and ambitious. By 1967, he had risen to the position of Chief Warrant Officer and worked as a watch officer and message center chief at the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. This position granted him access to the KL-47 cryptographic machines and the key lists that unlocked encrypted naval communications. He held in his hands the ability to read the most sensitive military traffic of the American submarine fleet, the silent service that represented America's ultimate nuclear deterrent. It was a position of profound trust. It was also a position that paid, in 1967, approximately $600 per month. Walker's financial situation was not unique among servicemen of his era. What distinguished him was his response to it. His wife, Barbara, whom he had married young, was struggling with alcoholism. His own spending was reckless. Boats, cars, the trappings of a lifestyle his Navy salary could not support. By late 1967, he was drowning in debt, facing the humiliation of bankruptcy, repossession, and the collapse of his carefully constructed self-image as a successful man. In December 1967, Walker made a calculation. He walked into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., and offered to sell classified information. There was no ideological conversion, no moment of political awakening. He later described his decision with brutal simplicity. He needed money, and he had access to material worth money. The KGB, never ones to question motivation when opportunity presented itself, agreed immediately. The initial payment was modest by the standards of what would follow, several $1,000s for a month's worth of key lists. But it was enough to solve Walker's immediate crisis. More importantly, it revealed to both parties the staggering value of what Walker could provide. The key lists he delivered allowed Soviet crypt analysts to read American naval communications. Not historical traffic, not partial decrypts. Complete, real-time access to the operational orders, patrol routes, and tactical communications of the American submarine fleet. Admiral James D. Watkins, who later served as Chief of Naval Operations, would describe the damage in stark terms. Walker had compromised all encryption systems that were involved in command and control of U.S. forces worldwide. Vitaly Yurchenko, after his defection, told American debriefers that Walker's intelligence had been so valuable that if war had broken out, the Soviet Navy would have known where every submarine was. For this access, the KGB eventually paid Walker approximately $1 million over 17 years, roughly $50,000 per year, tax-free. It was not so extraordinary sum by the standards of Cold War espionage. But for a man earning $600 per month, it was transformative. Walker purchased a sailboat. He opened a private detective agency. He lived the life he had always imagined he deserved. The mathematics of his personal economy had been resolved. The mathematics of his soul had been destroyed. What made the Walker case uniquely devastating was not merely the secrets one man stole. It was the way he transformed espionage into a family enterprise, recruiting those closest to him into a conspiracy that would span 2 decades and compromise virtually every aspect of American naval cryptography. The first recruit was Jerry Alfred Whitworth, Walker's friend and fellow radio man, who had served with him on the USS Niagara Falls. Whitworth was a senior chief petty officer with access to even more sensitive communication systems than Walker himself. In 1975, Walker approached him with a proposition that combined friendship, financial opportunity, and carefully applied pressure. Whitworth, who was contemplating retirement and worried about his financial future, agreed. For the next 8 years, Whitworth would deliver an astonishing volume of material to Walker. who served as the middleman to Soviet intelligence. Whitworth's position aboard various ships and at communications centers gave him access to the very highest levels of naval cryptography. The KGB considered him even more valuable than Walker himself. For his services, Whitworth received approximately $32,000, a sum that, in retrospect, seems almost insultingly modest for the catastrophic damage he inflicted. But Walker's most morally corrosive act was yet to come. In 1980, facing the possibility that his own access to classified materials would diminish as he approached retirement, Walker recruited his own son. Michael Lance Walker was 22 years old, a seaman aboard the USS Nimitz, the Navy's most advanced nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. He had grown up idolizing his father, unaware of the double life Walker had been leading since Michael was a child. When Walker approached him with the opportunity to make extra money by photographing classified documents, Michael agreed. What son would not trust his father? For the next 5 years, Michael Walker would steal documents from the Nimitz, photograph them using equipment his father provided, and pass them along through the established network. He received approximately $1,000 per month, pocket money by his father's standards, a fortune to a young enlisted man. Michael later testified that he had not understood the full implications of what he was doing, that his father had described it as something not that serious, that he had trusted the man who raised him. The final recruit was Arthur James Walker, John Walker's older brother. Arthur had retired from the Navy as a lieutenant commander and was working as a defense contractor at VSE Corporation, which had contracts with the Navy. Though his access to current classified material was limited compared to his brother's other recruits, he nonetheless provided documents related to naval systems and served as a backup courier. He would later claim he had been coerced by his brother, though prosecutors would prove he had been paid at least $500,000. By 1984, the Walker spy ring represented a multi-generational conspiracy that had compromised American naval security at virtually every level. A father had recruited his son. A brother had recruited his brother. A friend had betrayed his service. And the Soviet Union, for less than $2 million total, the cost of a single fighter aircraft, had purchased access to America's most sensitive military communications for nearly 2 decades. It was by any measure the most cost-effective intelligence operation in the history of the Cold War. And it was about to collapse in the most American way possible, through a family torn apart by its own contradictions. While John Walker was constructing his spy network and enjoying the financial benefits of his betrayal, his marriage was disintegrating. Barbara Walker, who had struggled with alcoholism throughout their marriage, had discovered her husband's espionage activities as early as 1967, within months of his initial contact with the Soviets. She had seen the money, heard his drunken confessions, and lived with the terrible knowledge of what he was doing. For years, she remained silent. The reasons were complex and painfully human. Fear of her husband's threats, concern for her children's welfare, financial dependence, and the corroded remains of marital loyalty. In a closed society, her silence might have continued indefinitely. The KGB had a brutal efficiency in ensuring that family members of agents remained compliant. Through fear, through complicity, through the absence of any alternative. But Barbara Walker lived in a society with alternatives. In 1976, after enduring years of her husband's drinking, violence, and infidelity, Barbara Walker filed for divorce. It was a decision that would have been impossible for the wife of a Soviet intelligence officer. In the USSR, divorce carried social stigma and often economic devastation. Women had limited independent economic opportunities. The state apparatus made leaving a powerful man extraordinarily difficult. In America, even the wife of a spy could walk away. After the divorce, Barbara struggled. She worked low-wage jobs, drank heavily, and lived with the burden of her secret knowledge. She approached the FBI in 1979, after years of internal turmoil, and told them her ex-husband was selling secrets to the Soviets. It should have been the end of the Walker spy ring. It was not. The FBI agent who interviewed Barbara Walker in 1979 concluded that she was not credible. She was a divorced alcoholic with an obvious grudge against her ex-husband. Her story seemed fantastic. She had no physical evidence. The agent filed a report and moved on. John Walker, unaware of how close he had come to exposure, continued his espionage activities for 6 more years. This failure of the FBI has often been portrayed as a catastrophic lapse in counterintelligence, and it was. But it also revealed something more subtle. Even in her failure to be believed, Barbara Walker had exercised a freedom unavailable to Soviet citizens. She had approached law enforcement without fear of being arrested herself for complicity. She had spoken openly about classified activities without immediately disappearing into a prison cell. The system had failed her, but the system had not crushed her for trying. She would try again. By 1984, the Walker spy ring appeared unassailable. John Walker had been operating for 17 years without detection. His network had expanded to include his son, his brother, and his friend. The KGB considered him their most valuable asset in America. Soviet submarine commanders planned their operations based on Walker's intelligence. The strategic balance of the Cold War had been fundamentally altered by one man's greed and the Soviet Union's willingness to exploit it. What the KGB had not calculated into their equations was Laura Walker Snyder, John Walker's daughter. Laura had grown up in the chaos of her parents' dysfunctional marriage. She had watched her mother's descent into alcoholism, witnessed her father's violence and infidelity, and lived through the trauma of their divorce. By the mid-1980s, she was a young woman trying to build a life separate from her family's dysfunction. She was married, had children of her own, and maintained limited contact with her father. Then, in 1984, she learned something that shattered what remained of her relationship with him. Her father had recruited her younger brother Michael into his espionage activities. The revelation came through family gossip, the kind of casual mention that reveals a terrible truth. Laura learned that Michael, her baby brother, was involved in something their father described as a business opportunity, something that involved classified materials and extra income. She confronted her mother, who finally told her the full story. Their father had been a Soviet spy for nearly 2 decades, and now he had dragged Michael into it as well. For Laura Walker Snyder, this was not merely a revelation of criminality. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any ideology. Her father had destroyed their family, corrupted her brother, and placed everyone she loved in legal and moral jeopardy. The money that had funded his lifestyle, the boats, the cars, the private detective business, was blood money earned by betraying the country her brother was serving. She made a choice that would have been impossible in the Soviet system. She decided to destroy her own father. In May 1985, Laura Walker Snyder contacted the FBI office in Boston. Unlike her mother's approach 6 years earlier, Laura was taken seriously immediately. She was coherent, detailed, and credible. She provided specific information about her father's activities, her brother's involvement, and the operational methods of the spy ring. She expressed no ideological motivation, no particular patriotism. She simply said, according to the FBI agents who interviewed her, that what her father was doing was wrong, and that her brother needed to be stopped before he destroyed his own life. The FBI launched an immediate investigation. Within weeks, they had placed John Walker under comprehensive surveillance. They watched him make a dead-drop delivery in Maryland, observed his counter-surveillance techniques, and documented his contact protocols with Soviet handlers. On May 20, 1985, they watched him leave a package at a dead-drop site near Poolesville, Maryland. On May 25th, they arrested him on Route 270. The Soviet Union had spent 17 years and roughly $1 million building the Walker spy ring. It had taken Laura Walker Snyder one phone call to destroy it. The arrests came swiftly. John Walker was taken into custody on May 25, 1985. His son Michael, aboard the USS Nimitz in the Mediterranean, was arrested the same day. Jerry Whitworth was arrested in California on June 3rd. Arthur Walker was arrested in Virginia shortly thereafter. The entire network collapsed within 2 weeks. What followed was a masterclass in the difference between how free and closed societies handle catastrophic intelligence failures. In America, the case exploded into the media. The Washington Post, the New York Times, and television networks covered every detail of the investigation, the arrests, and the subsequent trials. Naval officers gave interviews about the potential damage. Politicians held hearings. Intelligence officials testified publicly about the operational compromises. Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger announced that the Walker spy ring had done damage of the gravest nature. The American public learned that their submarine fleet's communications had been compromised for nearly 2 decades. They learned that a warrant officer motivated purely by greed had recruited his own family into espionage. They learned that the FBI had missed an opportunity to stop Walker in 1979. Every failure, every missed signal, every bureaucratic lapse was documented, analyzed, and broadcast. In the Soviet Union, silence. The KGB never publicly acknowledged the Walker operation, neither its spectacular success nor its ultimate failure. Soviet submarine commanders were quietly informed that a valuable intelligence source had been compromised. Procedures were changed. Operations were adjusted. But there was no public accounting, no explanation to Soviet citizens about how their government had purchased American secrets, and no discussion of why the operation had collapsed. This contrast was not incidental. It was fundamental to understanding why the Soviet system, for all its apparent successes in espionage, could never win the Cold War. The Walker case revealed uncomfortable truths about American society. That servicemen could be corrupted, that families could be torn apart by greed, that the FBI could fail to act on credible intelligence, that money could purchase betrayal. But American society possessed something the Soviet system lacked: the ability to expose, confront, and learn from its failures in full public view. The trials were public. Jerry Whitworth received 365 years in prison. John Walker received life imprisonment. Michael Walker, who cooperated with prosecutors and whose youth was considered a mitigating factor, received 25 years. Arthur Walker received 3 life sentences plus 40 years. Barbara Walker was granted immunity in exchange for her testimony. Laura Walker Snyder was never charged. She was a witness, not a participant. The sentences were severe, but they were the product of a legal system that operated in the open, where defendants had attorneys, where evidence was presented in court, where family members could testify without fear of reprisal. Michael Walker served his sentence and was released in 2000. John Walker died in prison in 2014, unrepentant to the end, still believing that his only mistake had been getting caught. In November 1985, 6 months after Walker's arrest, KGB officer Vitaly Yurchenko defected to the United States in Rome. Yurchenko was a senior officer in the KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for operations against the United States and Canada. His defection provided American intelligence with the most comprehensive insight into Soviet espionage operations since the end of World War II. Among the many operations Yurchenko revealed, he spoke at length about John Walker. His assessment was unambiguous. Walker had provided the most important intelligence collected by the KGB during the Cold War. The key lists Walker delivered had allowed Soviet cryptanalysts to read encrypted American naval communications that had previously been impenetrable. The intelligence had influenced Soviet naval strategy, submarine deployments, and contingency planning for potential conflicts. Yurchenko described how Walker's intelligence had been so valuable that special procedures were established to protect it. Only the most senior Soviet naval commanders had access to the intelligence derived from Walker's materials. The information was compartmented to prevent any possibility of compromise. The KGB had assessed that if Walker could be kept operational for another 5 years, the intelligence advantage would give the Soviet Navy a decisive edge in any future conflict. But Yurchenko also revealed something more subtle. Something that spoke to the fundamental miscalculation at the heart of Soviet intelligence operations in the United States. When asked why the operation had collapsed, he described the KGB's analysis of the arrest. Soviet intelligence had concluded that Walker must have been betrayed by a technical surveillance breakthrough, some new cryptanalysis capability, some signals intelligence coup that allowed the Americans to detect the dead drop communications. The actual cause, that Walker's own daughter had simply called the FBI, was, according to Yurchenko, met with disbelief in Moscow. It made no sense within the Soviet framework. Why would a daughter betray her own father? Why would she voluntarily destroy her family? Where was the ideological motivation? Where was the American intelligence service that had recruited her? The answer: that she had acted purely on her own moral judgment, that she had decided her father's actions were wrong, and that she had called the FBI without any coercion or recruitment, was almost incomprehensible to KGB analysts trained to see all human action through the lens of institutional manipulation. 3 weeks after his defection, Yurchenko changed his mind and returned to the Soviet Union, claiming he had been kidnapped by the CIA, a claim that remains disputed to this day. But the intelligence he provided about the Walker case was corroborated by other sources and by Walker's own confessions. His assessment of the operation's value was accurate. His description of Soviet incomprehension at its collapse was revealing. The KGB could understand betrayal for money. They had orchestrated it. They could understand betrayal for ideology. They had exploited it for decades. What they could not understand was betrayal for principle, in a society where principles were individual choices rather than state directives. The Walker spy ring represented the Soviet Union at its most effective. The KGB had identified a vulnerability, financial desperation in a capitalist society, and exploited it with ruthless precision. For less than $2 million, they had purchased intelligence that altered the strategic balance of the Cold War. By any measure of cost-benefit analysis, it was a staggering success. And yet, the very success contained the seeds of ultimate failure. The Soviet system operated on a mathematics of control. Intelligence services recruited agents through a combination of ideological persuasion, financial incentive, and coercion. Once recruited, agents were controlled through fear, through dependence, and through the comprehensive surveillance apparatus of the state. Families were leverage points, not liabilities, but assets. In the USSR, the family of a spy or defector could expect consequences. This created a powerful incentive for silence and complicity. The mathematics of control worked brilliantly in closed societies. The KGB's domestic operations were devastatingly effective because the Soviet state controlled every institution that might threaten an operation: the media, the legal system, the social safety net, even the boundaries of acceptable family relationships. But in open societies, the mathematics failed. Barbara Walker could divorce her husband without economic annihilation. Laura Walker could call the FBI without fear that she would be imprisoned for her family's crimes. Michael Walker could cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. The press could expose every detail of the failure, and the American public could absorb the revelation, demand accountability, and move forward. The Walker case was ultimately resolved not by the brilliance of American counterintelligence. The FBI had, after all, missed Barbara Walker's initial approach in 1979, but by the fundamental structure of American society. The same freedom that allowed John Walker to accumulate debt, to divorce his wife, to live beyond his means, also allowed his family to refuse complicity, to approach authorities, to choose principle over loyalty. This was the equation the KGB never solved. For every American they recruited through financial desperation, there existed the possibility that financial desperation would also drive family members to inform, to testify, to defect from the conspiracy. For every secret they purchased, there existed the possibility that the very openness of American society would expose the operation through mechanisms the KGB could neither predict nor control. The Soviet Union won battles in the intelligence war, but they could not win the war itself because the mathematics of control that governed their own society could not be applied to the societies they targeted. Every successful operation in an open society carried within it the mechanisms of its own exposure. The damage assessment of the Walker spy ring took years and was never fully completed. The Navy was forced to assume that every encrypted communication sent between 1968 and 1985 had been compromised. Submarine patrol routes were changed. Cryptographic systems were replaced at a cost of billions of dollars. Strategic plans were revised under the assumption that the Soviets had read them in real time. Admiral Carlisle Trust, who served as Chief of Naval Operations during the aftermath of the Walker case, described the damage as breathtaking in scope. He noted that the intelligence Walker provided could have given the Soviet Navy a decisive advantage in the event of war. The fact that war never came was, in his assessment, partially due to the deterrent effect of American military superiority in other domains, but also to the fundamental instability of the Soviet system itself. And that was the ultimate lesson of the Walker case. The Soviet Union could purchase betrayal, but it could not purchase stability. The KGB could recruit spies motivated by money, but it could not prevent those same spies from being betrayed by family members motivated by principle. The Soviet system could exploit the vulnerabilities of capitalism, but it could not comprehend the resilience that came from a society where individuals could make choices independent of state control. John Walker himself, in prison interviews conducted decades after his arrest, never expressed remorse for his espionage. He remained convinced that his only error was operational. He had been careless, he had trusted the wrong people, he had failed to anticipate his daughter's betrayal. He never understood that his daughter's betrayal was not a failure of operational security, but a function of the society he had himself helped compromise. In one interview, Walker was asked if he would do it again, knowing the outcome. He replied that he would, but more carefully. He would trust fewer people. He would be more selective in his recruiting. He would not involve his family. The interviewer pointed out that without his family, he would have had no one to recruit, no one to extend the operation, no one to provide access when his own clearances ended. Walker had no response. The contradiction was invisible to him. That contradiction, the impossibility of operating a long-term espionage operation in an open society without eventually being compromised by the very openness that made the operation possible, was the mathematics the KGB never solved. The Walker spy ring was the most financially successful intelligence operation the KGB ever ran against the United States. For approximately $2 million, they purchased 17 years of access to the most sensitive naval cryptography in the American arsenal. The intelligence altered Soviet military planning and provided a strategic advantage that could have proved decisive in the event of war. And yet, when the ledger was finally balanced, the operation represented not Soviet success, but Soviet failure. The KGB had operated on the assumption that every man had his price, that financial desperation could be exploited, that the contradictions of capitalism would provide endless opportunities for recruitment. These assumptions were not wrong. John Walker did have his price. Financial desperation could be exploited. The contradictions of capitalism did provide opportunities. What the Soviet system failed to understand was that the same freedoms that created those vulnerabilities also created countervailing forces that authoritarian intelligence services could neither predict nor control. Barbara Walker could leave her husband. Laura Walker could call the FBI. Michael Walker could cooperate with prosecutors. The press could expose every detail. And American society, for all its flaws and compromises, could absorb the revelation, punish the guilty, protect the innocent, and continue functioning. The Walker case ended not with a triumph of American counterintelligence, but with a daughter who said no. It ended not with a technological breakthrough, but with a family that broke apart because one member refused to accept moral complicity. It ended not because the system caught the spy, but because the system allowed those around him to choose principle over loyalty. In the end, the Cold War was decided not by which side could best exploit human weakness, but by which side had built a society resilient enough to survive that exploitation. The Soviet Union could purchase betrayal, but America, for all its vulnerability to corruption, had built something that could not be purchased. A society where even the families of traitors could choose to do the right thing. That choice, made by a daughter against her father, by a family against itself, by individuals against their own immediate interests, was the mathematics that mattered. And it was mathematics the KGB, for all its ruthless brilliance, could never understand.